Hey everyone, you're watching We Had That, and today I'm going to talk about the 1985 Wave 4 G.I. Joe Airtight action figure. The Dreadnoks were definitely the only figures that I cared about at all when the fourth wave of G.I. Joe figures first arrived in 1985. I had been reading about them in the comics, and I thought they were the absolute most awesome characters to come out lately. Footloose was the first figure I found in the store and picked up from Wave 4. When I saw the Dreadnoks on the back of his package and realized that they were coming out that year, they were at the very top of my list of figures that I absolutely had to have. Of course, there were a lot of great figures coming out that year, but one who didn't really initially captivate my attention from the illustrations on the back was the Hostile Environment guy, who turned out to be Airtight. Looking at my original card back now, the artwork's actually pretty cool, and seeing that price tag of $3.79 really makes me wish I'd bought two of each figure, one to open and one to keep carded. Even as a kid, I found some of the figures that were released in the G.I. Joe line to be a little bit too out there for me to really enjoy them. Even as far back as Wave 3, I didn't really understand why Blowtorch was dressed in yellow and red. The guys that I was used to seeing with a flamethrower in Vietnam movies, comic books, and historical photos were always dressed like regular soldiers, so why was Hasbro dressing this guy in bright colors? However, with Airtight, for some reason, the bright colors didn't bother me as much. Airtight wore a bright yellow jumpsuit with dark green accents. He had green gloves, a green belt, green boots, and a green helmet. He even wore a green chest piece under the black atmospheric gear on his chest. He had a pocket molded onto each leg of his pants, but most of his gear was actually made up of separate accessories. He came with a detachable green compressor pack backpack that I've always assumed was the machine that processed air samples to determine what chemicals were present in the air to figure out if it was safe to breathe. He had a black thing called a sniffer that seemed kind of like a vacuum cleaner to take in the air samples, and he came with two air hoses, one to connect the sniffer to the compressor pack, and one to connect his helmet to the compressor pack, I assume so that he could breathe clean air. But despite his bright non-military outfit, I think I always saw him more as a character who responded after Cobra had attacked, checking the air quality around the base or near the squad or whatever, rather than someone who was sneaking up on the enemy. I guess I thought of his brightly colored uniform as being kind of a warning to the guys on his team that there might be an issue with the air quality and they should stay back until he had a chance to check the area. So it didn't seem like he needed to be in a military-looking outfit to me. In fact, this was one case where I actually think the non-military-looking outfit worked for the G.I. Joe figure. According to his file card, Kurt Schnurr was a weird kid who could hold his breath longer than anyone else and grew up to be an even stranger adult who loves annoying practical jokes, sneezing powder, plastic barf, whoopee cushions, etc. But the other Joes didn't hate him because they respected that he was the guy walking into a cloud of toxic gas to keep them safe. The year that Airtight was released, 1985, we had already seen two 5-part G.I. Joe cartoons, and now we were finally getting season 1 of the ongoing cartoon. Airtight made his debut cartoon appearance in the opening credits of this, the first actual season. In fact, he can be seen a few times during the opening credits. Airtight first appears in a regular episode in Part 2 of Pyramid of Darkness as he watches an incoming message on screen on the USS Flag with a room full of troops. His first speaking part in the same episode is when he and Footloose are in the cockpit of a plane, and he sounds very socially awkward talking about how he thinks the two of them will make a great team for the mission. He appears again in the following episode, Pyramid of Darkness Part 3, where he's actually using some of his high-tech gear to try to determine if Cobra is around. In the episode Greenhouse Effect, Airtight develops a super weed spray to counteract the giant weeds that Cobras developed to overtake Chicago. Near the end of the episode, he releases the weed killer that he's been working on to shrink the killer vegetables. So this episode feels like it kind of uses his specialties pretty well. In the episode The Funhouse, Airtight has some of the most screen time of any episode of any G.I. Joe cartoon. He's part of the team that assaults the Cobra Temple and gets themselves trapped inside, but his knowledge of chemical warfare isn't used at all. In fact, when Dusty breaks a balloon filled with some kind of gas, even though Airtight tells him not to breathe it, Airtight still has no idea why Dusty is having an adverse reaction to breathing the contents. Almost any Joe would have been a better choice in this episode than Airtight, except maybe Torpedo, or maybe one of the pilots. But I guess, in all fairness, the Joe team didn't know what they were going to be going up against until they got there. Airtight's biggest role is definitely in the episode called The Germ. Not only does he have the most screen time of any of his appearances, but the most dialogue, and also it relates to his specialty. It would be the perfect episode for him, but it's quite a bit farther away from reality than most G.I. Joe stories are on this show, and that's saying a lot. Cobra steals a bacteria, which they accidentally combine with a growth formula to create a giant, and I really do mean giant, blob that's moving across the countryside. Airtight first shows up to pull Ace out of a plane that's leaking some sort of poisonous gas, which makes sense. Then he flies a giant hypodermic needle into the bacteria to destroy it. But there are Cobra missiles going off inside the bacteria while he's trying to steer around. The whole episode is like a lesson in science taught by someone who doesn't understand science at all. Worlds Without Ends Part 1 and 2 are another pair of episodes that feature Airtight quite a bit. I'll try to give a summary, but it's going to be difficult to follow this. Zartan and the Dreadnoks steal a device called the matter transmuter, which changes the molecular structure of anything it touches. Airtight shows up in a card game with some other Joes. Then Copperhead's trying to get the blueprints from the Joe team for the matter transmuter, which Copperhead is randomly holding while climbing up the side of a bridge. Copperhead accidentally shoots the bridge with the matter transmuter, and all of the Joes that are climbing on the bridge at the time get unknowingly sent to an alternate reality, and the bridge gets destroyed. The team is attacked by Cobra troops flying claws before they can even figure out where they are or what's going on. They find an ARAH striker when they duck into a cave to cover and quickly head out again to wherever they plan to go. Well, the engine blows out on the ARAH striker, but fortunately the Joes have just made it to the Bargains and Bait Shop, a little wooden country store where they're able to buy 8 motorcycles and randomly get information about rumors of where the G.I. Joes are hidden when they went underground. The team soon learns that the G.I. Joe headquarters has been shut down by order of Cobra Commander, and so they break into it. Over the rest of Part 1, the Joe team learns that Cobra has taken over the world and wears slightly different uniforms. In Part 2, Airtight, along with Flint and Barbecue, escape from the Dreadnoks, who are cops now, and get away in a Cobra Fang. Aside from that, there's not much from Airtight in Part 2, but seeing skeletons of dead Joes is one noteworthy thing in this episode that you might not expect to see in a kid's show. Something else you don't see much of in the G.I. Joe cartoon, members of the team leaving the show. At the end of the episode, Grunt, Steeler, and Clutch stay behind in the alternate dimension to fight for the resistance against Cobra. However, nothing in either of these 2 episodes uses any of the military specialties that Airtight possesses. Airtight was featured in one of the famous G.I. Joe public service announcements, knowing is half the battle. He taught kids what to do when someone passes out, but it's difficult to know exactly what he taught them from this screen grab. Airtight's in about 10 more episodes for a second or two, in quick, blink-and-you-missed-it parts, but those are still more appearances than he made in the comics. Although Airtight at least showed up briefly in a fair amount of the Sunbow cartoon episodes, he had very few appearances in the 1980s Marvel comic book series. His first appearance was one of his largest in issue number 44 from February of 1986, where he and several of the other new G.I. Joe team members and vehicles are introduced. In this issue, training exercises are interrupted by Dr. Mindbender's android bats who attack the Joe team. Dr. Mindbender basically kidnaps the Joe team and their vehicles and puts them in a giant maze to prove to Destro and the Baroness that his new weapon is awesome. But of course, the G.I. Joes beat Mindbender and his bats in the end. Airtight's big scenes are first when the bats attack the Joe team with seed pods that spray gas in their face. Airtight incorrectly identifies it as pollen, and Lady J corrects him, saying that it's actually not pollen, it's sleeping gas. So our introduction to the G.I. Joe team's new air toxin expert is his being corrected about an air toxin by a G.I. Joe team member who's not at all an air toxin expert. And second, when he puts together an air filter mask out of junk from a junkyard. The next time we see Airtight in the comics is in a single panel as part of a group image in issue number 49. Airtight did have several appearances on one page of issue number 54, but this really could have been any G.I. Joe character. He's not even wearing the uniform that the figure wears, just a plain camo outfit. On this page, he tells Hawk that another terrordrome has just shown up, this time in Sierra Gordo. Since the Joes aren't allowed to do any recon on Cobra Island, where the first terrordromes were seen, Airtight suggests that they let a Joe get captured at the base in Sierra Gordo for an inside look. That's the last time we hear from Airtight in the main G.I. Joe comic for about the next 75 issues. By the time he appeared again, I wasn't even following the comics anymore. I think Airtight might have appeared in fewer than a dozen of the regular G.I. Joe comics in total, and in several of those, he was only a minor character on a panel or two. His last brief appearance is in issue number 144, which is really mostly just about Snake Eyes, Scarlet, and some of the other original Joes. Airtight doesn't really contribute much to this, his final original story run. Despite his lack of much use in the regular issues of the comic, Airtight appears in 2 issues of G.I. Joe's Special Missions comics. In Special Missions number 2, a World War II bomber is found partially frozen in a glacier in Greenland. A Nazi war criminal who's been hiding in Brazil claims that the plane is packed with canisters filled with nerve toxins. He claims to be the only one who knows how to safely deactivate them, and he wants to make a deal. Airtight's on the team that finds the plane and runs into Cobra in the process. Even though only half of the story involves Airtight, the other half of the story follows the Joe team in Brazil meeting up with the Nazi war criminal. The half in Greenland with Airtight uses his skills within the story very well. For a comic book created with the purpose of selling toys to kids, this story about a Nazi war criminal is seriously heavy. The half in Brazil blew my mind as a kid, and even now holds up as a very powerful story, even when I'm reading it as an adult. I believe Special Missions number 21 is the only time that Airtight is featured on the cover of a comic book. In this issue, Airtight's skills are used numerous times in the first half of the story, when the team of Joes is trudging around through a sewer and they find canisters that they think might be Cobra nerve gas, and again when they're attacked by Cobra with smoke that they suspect might be nerve gas. Airtight's able to test it out and determine that it's harmless smoke. Later in the story, the team finds a large canister which Airtight is able to identify as a particularly nasty type of nerve toxin. So this, once again, is a good example of a story that uses Airtight's actual skills in the G.I. Joe comic. Most of the G.I. Joe comics were written a lot better and for more mature audiences than the cartoons, but the Special Missions stories in particular were even more well written. These 2 Special Missions stories are exactly the type of stories that I wanted for Airtight. Pseudo-real-world type situations that use the skills that the figure's supposed to have. I definitely understand that Marvel was selling toys to kids, but I was a kid buying these toys at the time, reading these comics every month, and I responded much better to the more serious special missions type stories than to the less mature cartoon series. Lastly, like every other G.I. Joe character who was out at the time, Airtight had a page in an issue of the G.I. Joe Order of Battle comic book with the text from his file card and a single image of the character. That's about it for Airtight back in the original run. As a quick side note, Airtight in the Sunbow cartoon didn't look anything like Airtight in the comics, so this was clearly a case of each team, cartoon and comic, not paying attention to what the other team was doing. Not surprisingly, Airtight didn't show up much outside of his few cartoon and comic book appearances, but he was featured on the box art for the G.I. Joe Tactical Battle platform. I'm curious to hear what you thought of Airtight. Did you have an Airtight action figure when you were a kid? Was he a favorite of yours, or was he one of the first to die on each mission? Tell me in the comments below. Also, please give this video a thumbs up, and if you have a chance, it would be great if you'd share it on social media. If you enjoy my content, please subscribe to my channel and hit that notifications bell so you'll be notified when I post new videos. And one last thing, if you're a fan of toys, you should know about ToyLanta, the biggest toy show in the southeastern United States, held annually just north of Atlanta, Georgia. Visit ToyLanta.com for more information. As always, thanks for watching.